After 2 years, we finally had a good season of Big Brother. Big Brother 21 was essentially the Survivor Thailand of Big Brother, and Big Brother All-Stars 2 is drier than Keisha's birthday cake. This season had a great cast, with some of the best players and characters we've seen since Big Brother 20. This season made history with having the first ever black winner, and I may also add that this season has one of the most amicable casts of all time, with there being little to no fights within the house. The closest we got to an argument the entire season was at the Final Four, which that barely even counts as one. But we have to start somewhere, and we'll start at the bottom. Travis would be higher, no doubt, if he hadn't been the first boot, and he's probably the most robbed first boot ever. I like to think that he was generally well-liked in the house the first week, but Frenchie's week 1 HOH was disastrous, and Travis was targeted as a replacement nominee, and Frenchie liked to think he had a mega alliance that voted to evict Travis, but I think it was a little more that he was just up on the block next to Alyssa, who, come on, nobody's gonna vote Alyssa out week 1 against Travis, like him or not. It's not unusual to see a meathead, as Frenchie calls him, go home week 1, but I still saw potential in Travis. I thought he could be a second Tyler, but unfortunately we'll never know if that would have been the case. As much as I would want to make all these rankings 100% personal, if I can't make a genuine impression of them because they went too early, then they have to go to the bottom, which is why I put Travis under Whitney, because although I strongly disliked Whitney, she actually had a chance to play the game. Going into her first appearance, I wasn't too impressed by her, and then going into the house, she aligned herself with the wrong people, namely Frenchie, and even though she seemed to have a good thing going with her fellow aces, it wasn't enough to escape a pre-jury targeting, and I like to credit her week 4 eviction to association with Frenchie, as she and another ally of his went out in back-to-back weeks. Here's the other pre-juror who flew too close to Frenchie. He was the cocky alpha male of the season, and hot take here, but I actually thought he could do really well this season, if he aligned with the right people, which he didn't. Ironically, Frenchie was coming after him early on in week 1, which they quickly bonded and became each other's #1 allies. Then everything fell apart for them, and Frenchie and his entourage were picked off by the rest of the house one by one, with Brent going out week 3, also in part because people were sick of his personality anyways. I'm not really crazy on floaters, and I wasn't really crazy on Alyssa. She started the season on a sour note, being nominated week 1, so she was obviously extremely paranoid, and from there she just seemed to get dragged along throughout the pre-merge by her showmance and his alliance until he was blindsided right before jury, and that's where she really became a floater, hanging by the thread that was Xavier until her long overdue eviction in 7th place. I just think she's a little too one-dimensional. She didn't really do that much. She didn't make that many big moves, and the one time she had a special advantage in the game from the high rollers room, it resulted in her #1 ally getting put up on the block, so in a way she was sort of a joke this season. This was about as high as I could possibly have put Frenchie, and if I'm being honest, not having him at dead last is probably a hot take on its own, but although I wouldn't say that Frenchie is one of the worst players of all time, I think he definitely has one of the most fiery flameouts we've ever seen on the show. He started off the top dog, winning HOH and making deals with everyone. He tried to make a mega alliance you just know he'd been hoping to form long before he set foot in the house, and it was so confusing that I didn't even know who was all in the alliance and who wasn't. It was like how Audrey from Big Brother 17 tried to rope a ton of unnecessary people into her alliance, but Frenchie actually did that all himself as the leader of his own alliance. But in his defense, most of the chaos that first week came from his constant shifting in who he was targeting, because it wasn't an easy week for him. He wanted to target a meathead, but after he accidentally made friends with too many of them, his target shifted to Derek X, who then won veto, so he had to go up and put up Travis instead. That whole week, he was just slowly falling apart, and going into the following week, he burned whatever relationships he still had remaining within the house and basically sealed his fate. Now, the last time a Southern person had a first HOH flameout this hard, he was hauled off by production for headbutting another player, so at least Frenchie took the easy way out. But you're maybe wondering why I put Frenchie so high. Because he was a super fan. He clearly knew how the game worked, and had that first week not been such a disaster in ways he couldn't necessarily control, and ways he could, he may have stood a much better chance to make it further. And after Frenchie was gone, it was Christian who took the season by the reins. He started off doing well enough in the house, and after Frenchie left, he really gained some traction with the Royal Flush Alliance, which consisted of him and his fellow kings, their remaining queens left, and Derek X as their literal ace in the hole. For a while, they dominated, while an alliance that proved to be much more powerful than even them was still developing, knocking off the other aces that they didn't like, and bringing in Hannah as a second ace, but more because Tiffany accidentally revealed the existence of the alliance to her. But it was the last pre-jury week of the season where the Royal Flush started to crumble. Derek X was head of household, and he was, as As he was the only ace in the alliance, he was sort of the wild card, and he was itching to make a big move. He saw that Christian was on a roll, he had already won several competitions, and it was better to take him out now than later. So when Britini pulled herself off the block with the veto, Derek took the shot and put Christian up, blindsiding him, and although Christian and his biggest allies made it seem like putting him up wouldn't work, they all just couldn't resist anyways and voted him out. So that's why he's so low. He had the pre-jury phase of the game by the horns. He was just, well, a meathead, and his strategic game wasn't on full display, so his game as a whole just didn't have a very long shelf life. Now we sort of dig into the good players that were greatly eclipsed by other alliances this season, and I don't know how good of a player she was, but considering she was seen as a sort of snake for a long time before she was finally evicted, must stand for something. I mean, it didn't hurt that her ride or die was Kyland, who was running the house at that point, but on top of that, she also had an actual game as opposed to the other loose-end allies of the cookout like Britini or Alyssa. Similar to Christian, her time in the house had a pretty incoming expiration date that she just couldn't seem to avoid, and once it was down to just the cookout and their duos, they decided to take the next shot at SB. I'm guessing because Claire had done more and promised more short-term protection than SB did, and Alyssa is just Alyssa. So basically, this was the first person on this list that was actually a decent player. She just sort of pales in comparison to the other non-cookout duos as well. So I guess Big Brother is continuing the trend of having laughable runner-ups, which is why 2 years in a row the jury vote was unanimous, and the votes weren't for Big D. Now in his defense, he started off the game with one of the best social games I think I'd ever seen. He seemed to be well-liked by pretty much everyone, and he cemented himself as sort of an entertaining GOAT, someone that, save for his social game, wouldn't be someone hard to beat in the end, but even in the beginning, I was thinking that it would be kind of hard to beat him. And he just worked a few angles silently. If he did work a few angles silently, I should say, he could have had maybe a better case for himself going up to the final two. Now, the cookout definitely saved him, as if not, he along with Azah would probably be associated too much with Frenchie and Britini, the two other jokers, but because of the firm grip the cookout had on the entire season, he was able to coast on to the end, where he was even more of a GOAT, as even his social game was in shambles because of the occasional quarrels he'd had with some of the members of his own alliance. So he formed a men's alliance that he ends up turning on a week later at the Final Four. Now, the Final Three is laughable, with two competitive duds and the biggest comp beast of the season at the very end, and because of this, Derek may have already lost the final HOH, but he had already won the prize money for runner-up, because there was no way he was not going to be sitting there at the Final Two as a GOAT. Sure, he was funny to watch, especially on the feeds. You could tell by how he talked to people in the house that he wasn't going anywhere for a long time, just the charm he had on people. He just didn't have a great resume to win the game, and at first, I wasn't crazy about Azah. I think she seemed sort of invisible in the house, and her initial gameplay was subtle enough that I was skeptical of how far it would take her, but the longer she stayed in the house, it became more clear why she was doing so well, as she was just a likable person. I can't think of one person who disliked her, and thus nobody targeted her. One thing that I thought was brilliant was how she would pretend to be crying, and I think it was Tiffany's shoulder, and in actuality, they were just talking strategy, but it looked like they were crying. Her position in the cookout was helpful for her game, too, as she wasn't necessarily a prominent game player, so to speak, so when the time came for the cookout to go against each other, Azah wasn't targeted initially. However, the guys on the cookout ruled the Final Six, and Xavier and Big D had a Final Two deal, so by the time Azah was just sitting at the Final Three, she was looking like a lock for the final juror, which she ended up being just that. So yeah, I guess she wasn't as invisible in the end, and in any other season, she would have actually stood, I think, a small chance to win on likability, but this season had way too many power plays for her to reach the winner's circle. It was the end of Kyland's game that dropped him several spots for me. Other than that, he would have likely been at or near the podium. Kyland came out swinging this season, dominating challenges, taking names, but not necessarily making a target of himself. He was a smooth-talking guy that most people could get along with. The first real negative look he really had was when he took out his own duo and Britini while he was head of household, which wasn't really something the other members of the cookout did to their duos. Similarly to Cody and Tyler last season, it was a showdown between him and Xavier for who could win, and this time it was being speculated on weeks out from the finale. And even going into the Final Six with the cookout, he seemed to be in a good spot with the gentleman's alliance he had, until one surprise double eviction later when Xavier wins out of household and he realizes that it would make more sense to take Kyland out now instead of honoring his alliance. So he orchestrates a blindside. Kyland proceeds to choke on the most crucial veto challenge yet, and Xavier successfully blindsides him, with Kyland going out in the most fiery exit we've seen, with him taunting Xavier at the door, pushing his every last nerve until it looks like a fight is about to break out. Yeah, kind of a fall from grace for Kyland, but he still played a righteous game in my opinion. Hannah started off with great potential. She just had a very sucky team, with Derek X being her real only anchor, keeping her safe in the house until the cookout was in full effect. And I mean, I guess that might be a little bit of an overreaction, but considering the rest of her team of the Aces were kind of a hot mess, I could see how Hannah could have possibly gone out sooner than she did. She was always safe because of the alliances she was in, though, but she didn't have a strong enough endgame. Her duo was a far better player than her, which was really the only example of that within the cookout, where the duo, the person that they were kind of stringing along, was actually had better, like, strategic prowess than them. And she was, she also didn't have a very impressive resume of challenge wins, but by the time the final 6 rolled around, she was sort of caught with her tail between her legs, and she didn't have much where else to turn. So hence why she was cut at the double eviction in only 5th place, which makes sense, as at that point in the game, I was trying to think as a juror, and I wasn't super keen on voting for her had she been at the final 2. Claire was just one of the people who you could tell just by her opening interview and introduction that she was going to be a great player. She was shown to excel in social and strategic gameplay and could win a challenge when needed, but sadly her best move was aligning with Tiffany, which makes sense as they were both on the Queen's team at the beginning of the season. But it was Tiffany who kept her safe long into the jury portion of the game, when the cookout was holding their dominion over the house. Claire was chosen second to last of the non-cookout members to go because she was a duo and one closer to the actual cookout itself than the other duos. But that wasn't enough for her to survive that first double elimination, where she was evicted in 8th place, which sounds surprisingly low for someone who still found ways to dominate the game in her own right. Listen, I know that Britini's game was a train wreck, but she was one of my favorites this season. She reminded me a lot of Ian Terry. She seemed to have some potential to do well in the game, and although she was often portrayed as a joke on this season, she was able to pull out one veto win, and I think it was her sheer determination to thank for that. But she was nominated far too often, and she just sort of became a target just to get it over with. For the most part, she was a pawn until Kyland just decided to get her out in week 6. I'm still not sure why he did that. DX, one of the best players to only make it a little bit into the jury phase. This kid lit it up. He was targeted almost instantly for maybe playing too hard too quickly, but he proved his strength in the game by winning 2 clutch vetoes back to back, and from there making meaningful and lasting bonds with the rest of the house. So people suddenly wanted to keep him around because as long as a bold and courageous player was working for them, it was okay if such a player stayed. However, his rise to the top didn't last long, as the cookout was soon climbing up as well, and once jury rolled around, DX was the biggest target out of the duos, and his friends from the Royal Flush were in low supply now, so he just sort of faded out from the game. Not to mention that also a lot of the members of the Royal Flush were also part of the cookout. In any other season, this guy was probably your winner. He wasn't afraid to make game-changing moves, and he was able to make enough friends in the house so that his threat level went down just enough. So he's definitely someone I'd like to see play again. The woman who was the brains behind the cookout. She brought them together and hatched the master plan that led to their wild success throughout the game. Even before that, she was a respected leader of the Queen's team and seemed to grow a little following of her own, even through some of her own struggles with members of the cookout. But thick and thin, she was able to get voted out in 6th place. Wait, what? Oh, how did that happen? Well, after it was just the cookout left, all the guys teamed up and also dominated the challengers from there on out, so she and Chaddha were picked off back-to-back in the second double eviction. She's still one of my favorites this season, and probably the most surprising player ever based on first impressions, because I didn't really get a vibe at the beginning of, like, the season that she was going to be such a great player, but she killed it. However, there had to be one person to have a perfectly executed game from beginning to end, and that was Xavier. He played low physically at first, throwing challenges and only winning once he needed to, and formed strong bonds with the rest of the house. He had his kings, his royal flushes, and let's not forget the cookout, all keeping him safe. He was playing this like chess. He made sure that he had every possible, like, angle of the house, keeping him safe. There was never a word uttered once about him being a target for practically the whole season, which was very ironic because he was on the block many times, but that was either because he was a pawn or some sort of twist. Twists hated Xavier this year, but that didn't matter because by the time the cookout was in full swing, he was unstoppable. Finally showing his good and entertaining disposition continued to keep him safe deep into the game, where he made one more guy's alliance to seal himself a spot at the end, and at that point he just couldn't be stopped. He could easily win all the remaining columns and had the chance to take out his only remaining competition for the 750K in Kyland. And boom, we have yet another 9-0 vote winner in the jury. What a season, what a winner. And you know what? Yeah, I really liked this season. And another thing I realized is I'm pretty sure that the Cookout also has made history by, I'm pretty sure they're the first 6, and this accolade sounds really specific, but it's still impressive, that I'm pretty sure they are the first 6-member alliance, which is a pretty hefty size, to make it to the final 6, which means that they made it to the final, they're the first alliance and only alliance in Big Brother history to make it to the final 6 with all of their members still intact. And I'm pretty sure the closest we've ever got to that was level 6, which was also a 6-person alliance, making it to the final 5 with 4 original members still intact, and JC, who is kind of like a honorary member, like kind of like a helper. So that's the closest that we got, and now we have this. So Cookout is probably like the best alliance that I've ever seen on this show. But anyways, yeah, great season, loved it. And I'm sorry, yes, I will make the Kasaya video next. I just realized I started writing the script for this and I was like, my life has been really busy right now, so I haven't been able to make this video, but now I have. So like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you at Kasaya.